Hello, I'm Brandon Bate, the registrar here at Hard Mountain, and welcome to this video. If you saw Sam Mihara's video about his father and his father's experience here at Hard Mountain, then you know that his father went blind and created, in fact, a system of Braille to use with Japanese at Hard Mountain. This here is the board that he used to create that system of Braille. Now, joining me is Callie Stussy, our museum manager, and she is the only staff member we have that speaks Japanese. So, Callie, what can you tell me about this Braille board?
So in terms of the Japanese written on it, most of it is pretty much what you would expect. The panel here at the bottom explains that this board was the brainchild of Mihara Tokinobu. And then over here, it explains that this board was created at a wartime confinement location from 1942 to 1945. The section over here gives the location. It says North America, the United States, Wyoming, and then Hart Mountain. And then at the top it says New Style Japanese Braille. So that's pretty much what you'd expect. The interesting part about this, for me at least, is the writing that he chose to represent on this board. So I'm going to have to kind of get into the geeky details about Japanese here, but most people are familiar with the concept of Japanese as being a language that is complicated. And the writing system in particular is complicated. Some linguists have argued that Japanese may be the hardest writing system to learn. Part of that is that Japanese originally borrowed the writing system of China. The problem is that Chinese and Japanese are actually completely unrelated languages. And so there are aspects of Japanese that cannot be represented well with Chinese. So for example, verbs. So in Chinese, you can basically have a verb and then a character for a verb and then a character for the past tense. So you can think of that as in English, you add an ed. Well, in Japanese, it's a bit more like English's strong verbs. So for example, when you say write, the past tense is not righted, it's wrote. You actually change the sound of the verb. Okay. Because of that, Japanese needed a way of representing sound without necessarily having it be tied to a meaning. So they developed a syllabary. And so Japanese writing is a mix of the fancy Chinese characters and then the much simpler syllabary, the hiragana, that are used to represent grammatical structures and things like that. Fun fact, Japanese actually has two syllabaries. Initially, they were kind of thought of as being men's writing and women's writing. So the hiragana I mentioned before are kind of considered the women's writing, or that's what they were originally. There's another system called katakana. It's usually, visually, it's sharper in shape. And for a while, it was considered the masculine form of writing. But by the time of the Meiji era, which was the late 1800s and early 1900s, Japanese writing had basically standardized itself into a mix of the Chinese characters and the hiragana for regular Japanese, and then the katakana were used for foreign words and sometimes used for emphasis. Now, the reason I walked you through that long talk is that this board uses katakana. It uses that less common system. I'm not sure why, but I do have a couple of guesses. When I asked Sam Mihara about this, he did point out that, in fact, katakana are used to represent foreign language words. So it might make sense that if you are creating a Braille system like this in an English-speaking country, it might be useful to use that system. However, there's another interesting little historical fact here. Right around 1900, the Meiji government tried to institute a writing reform. There were a lot of concerns that the Japanese writing system was too clunky to be a modern writing system. And so there was a big push to simplify, to phase out a lot of the Chinese characters, and to standardize. So for a while, government documents and the like were written not using hiragana, but actually a mix of the Chinese characters, the kanji, and katakana. In addition, and this is something I only stumbled across very recently, there were people who would write documents in Japanese entirely using a syllabary. So what they would do is they would write, they would use the katakana basically as an alphabet, the way we would write, with a few small exceptions. The particles that are used for grammar in Japanese, so this would be something equivalent to or in or from in English. In those documents that are written almost entirely in katakana, those particular particles are written using hiragana, which makes it really interesting that in this corner right here are the 4 most commonly used particles in hiragana. So he deliberately included those as their own special symbols within his Braille system. The other thing that maybe might make people curious is the number of characters on this.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It definitely, the number of characters made this quite a large artifact. It's a little over 28 inches in width here and 18 inches high, which can make it unwieldy to transport. So not only was the Braille board created, a custom case was created for the system as well. We're fortunate enough to have both. As you can see, the Braille board has survived time much better than the case here has, but that means the case has served its purpose.
It did its job. And the other thing is that with the Japanese writing system, you actually have to have this many characters in it, because the syllabaries in Japanese are actually called the 50 sounds. They're not actually 50 of them, but it's pretty close, and they're usually represented in this sort of grid. So if you look at this grid, what he has, these 5 characters right here are the vowels, and then the rest of the syllables are created by adding a consonant at the before the vowel.
Okay.
So you have this column, so this is the a vowel, and then you have ka, sa, ta, na, ha, ma, ya, ra, wa. And anybody who has studied Japanese has probably memorized the thing I just said. It's kind of the Japanese equivalent of the alphabet song.
There you go.
But it has this very nice system where, okay, everything on here has the a vowel. Everything here has the e vowel. And then over here, he actually kind of ran out of space, and so he continued the column through that. So he actually did a remarkably good job at squeezing in all of the information used in that writing system onto this one board. So that's the quick overview of this Braille board, but obviously the board and also the story of Sam Mihara's father and all of that is very closely tied to the story of the hospital at Heart Mountain. So, Brandon, why don't you go ahead and introduce some of the other artifacts that we have in the archives that are tied to the hospital?
Sure, Kelly, and if you would like to follow me, as well as you at home, we'll go take a look at some of those artifacts in our collection. Welcome back. As you can see, we have brought out another piece of our collection, this wheelchair here. Similarly, coming up on your screen now, we'll have a photo of a pharmacist scale that is currently on exhibit that you can't really access it and get it out of the case though, so you'll just have to stare at this picture.
So, this is huge. Would this have been a normal design for wheelchairs of that time period?
Yes, pretty much. This is, according to research that's been conducted into the history of wheelchairs as items, a very 19th century design. They first became popular following the Civil War, of course, a war that left many of its wounded with amputated limbs. And it very much has sort of the piece of furniture feel to it, with the wicker back and the seat, as well as the armrests and the very sturdy leg rests. Similarly, wheelchairs like this weren't necessarily meant for day-to-day private use. You can see that by the fact that the large wheels are in the front and the smaller caster wheels are in the back. It makes it difficult to do things like get up on a curb or get over humps in a sidewalk or over a portal, something like that. Modern wheelchairs, the collapsible kind you may be more familiar with, were invented in the early 30s, but didn't become popular until following World War II.
Oh. So, do we know whose wheelchair this was?
Not really. We know that it was owned by the War Relocation Authority. It has a property of sticker at the bottom of the back there. However, when it came to us, it was originally a loan from the Homesteader Museum over in Powell, and unfortunately, we don't really have good records for what's called its provenance or its history. Really, all we know is that it was owned by the WRA and was used at Hurt Mountain.
What about the pharmacy scale? Do we have any additional information on that?
Unfortunately, it's much the same story. According to the research that I've done into just pharmacist scales in general, the case that it's contained in is to protect its accuracy, essentially, from dust or humidity. But unfortunately, its story was more or less lost as well. All we know, again, is that it was used at Hart Mountain.
So how would museums normally maintain the story of an artifact like that?
Sure. A lot of that has to come from the donor. That's why we love family members that bring in things, because they can tell us, my father used it like this, my mother used it like this, my great aunt, etc., etc.
Like the Braille board.
Exactly, like Sam's Braille board. We write that down and we keep that in what's called an accession file, which contains things like the deed of gift that the donor signed saying that, yes, we, Hurt Mountain, are now in legal possession of the artifact. And, of course, any other information that we may have on the artifact.
Okay, well, I think that's all that we have in our archives for the hospital, pretty much.
Some of the major highlights, yeah.
All right, well, thank you for joining us for this.
We hope you enjoyed it, and please continue enjoying the content produced by the Virtual Pilgrimage.
Thank you.